It's really my debut presentation, so if I seem a little nervous, that's why, but I felt that I had to do this. This is very important story for me. So just about Irvington, I've been a resident of Irvington since 1997, when my husband David and I and our two daughters, Emily and Naomi, moved from Hartsdale. And my two daughters went to high school here, had a great experience at the Irvington schools, and I very much appreciate the Irvington Library. And Cachette reminded me today that I have a book that's way overdue, and I promised Cachette that I'm going to return it very soon. So the Irvington Library has been a great source of information for myself and my family. So I'm here tonight to present my mother's story of love and survival during the years of World War II. And it's a very opportune time, I think, to speak about the Holocaust, because yesterday marked the 82nd anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. So after years of hateful speech and terrible anti-Semitic propaganda through anti-Jewish newspapers, books, magazines, rallies, radio speeches, Kristallnacht really marked the start of violent action against the Jews, and historians say it was really the start of the Holocaust. And I think it's also an opportune time to talk about the Holocaust, because unfortunately there's been a real increase in anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, both in the US and globally in the past few years. And lastly, sadly, through recent surveys show that there's a terrible lack of knowledge about the Holocaust among many Americans. So it's a very timely topic. So both my parents are Holocaust survivors from Romania. And I always knew from a very young age that they went through something unspeakable when they were young. But I never asked them any questions about it because I didn't want to upset them. And at some level, I really didn't want to know. My parents are now deceased. They passed away in 2012 within a few months of one another. Most Holocaust survivors are no longer alive today to tell their stories. I got involved with an organization called the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center a few years ago after hearing a second-generation survivor tell her mother's story at my temple, Temple Beth Abraham in Tarrytown. She spoke so meaningfully about her mother's experience that I spoke to her afterwards, and she told me that the HHREC has a story keepers workshop for second and third generation survivors. So after thinking about it for a while, I finally took the workshop, and it was just a wonderful experience because I got to meet with other second generation survivors, and we supported and understood each other. So it was a great experience. And I chose to present my mother's story because she has a surviving family, and they were able to fill in some of the blanks for me. Also, so what I'm about to tell you is, family stories that my mother told me, that my aunt and cousins told me, that my mother told them. And also very fortunate that both my parents gave testimony for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation back in 1996. So I have those records to go by. So now I'll get into my mother's story. So my mother was a very warm and loving person. She charmed everyone she met. I never knew anybody not only like, but kind of fall in love with my mother. She was very happy, upbeat, and welcoming. She had a smile that would light up the room. She loved her friends and family deeply and just delighted in family celebrations. And here, this photo that you see here is taken from a family Bat Mitzvah in Indianapolis. It was taken a few years before she passed away. So you could see that she loved to have a good time. She was a great hostess also, and she took care to make her gatherings very special with her delicious Hungarian cooking. Unfortunately, I don't have that same talent that she had in the kitchen, much to my family's disappointment. Yet, there was a lot below the surface with my mother. From a very young age, I felt that at some level, my mother was a bit sad and a bit fragile, and I felt that she needed my protection. So as a result, I was always well-behaved, and I rarely asserted myself. I always went along with what I thought was expected of me, and I didn't really express my wants and needs. My mother, Lily, was born in 1927, and she didn't experience a lot of day-to-day anti-Semitism in her earlier years, with one notable exception. In July of 1930, when she was just 3 years old, the Iron Guard, a Romanian fascist party, set fire to 132 Jewish homes in the town of Borșa, her hometown. Lily's home was spared. She never told me that story. Instead, I heard about it from her Shoah tape, and also her cousin Zita told me about it many years later, because my mother preferred to tell me about the happier moments of her childhood. So, click anywhere? Okay. Here we go. Okay, so this is a picture of my mother's hometown of Borșa, Romania. So this is where she grew up. It's a small village. She was one of 6 children. She lived in her maternal grandparents' house. It was one of the largest homes in town, and the family was quite well-to-do. They ran a dairy farm, and they had a vinegar factory and a general store. The area is quite beautiful with mountains, rivers, and forests. My mother would tell me how she could see the snow-capped Carpathian Mountains from her bedroom window. The house is pictured here. It's still standing today, and it's the town's post office. Now, in the photo to the left, you see my mother standing in front in 1972, when her and my dad went back there for a visit. And in 2019, I was fortunate enough to make a trip to Romania with my oldest daughter, Emily, and here is a picture of the house on the right side in 2019. So when we went to visit the house in 2019, we were very excited. We had a Romanian guide with us, and she spoke to the postmistress there who was running the post office, and she explained to them that we had come a very long way and that this was the family's ancestral home. And we would like to look around if it was possible, and, could we, perhaps go into the back rooms where the architecture would have been original, and maybe upstairs, and that it would have been the thrill of our lifetimes. Well, the woman looked me up and down, and she said, no, it's forbidden, you can't do it. So, there's still this kind of anti-Semitic feeling with some of the people in Romania today. It's really tragic. There are no Jews left in Romania, but, they still don't like us. So we were very disappointed, and we walked out, and there was a gate, and there was a couple of women at the gate. The gate was locked, and the tour guide told the women by the gate what had happened, and they said, and they were younger, and they said, what a witch. Why wouldn't she let you in? That's horrible. Come, I'll open the gate. You can come in through the back. At least you can see the backyard, the back of the house. And we were so grateful, and we went back there, and this is what we saw. And, it made me feel so much better. And because I could picture my mother and her siblings running around and playing in that beautiful meadow. And it just, I was very grateful to those 2 women. And just to tell you that, not everybody, is anti-Semitic. There are some very well-meaning and friendly people there that we came across, luckily. So, oops. Okay, so here is a very small family tree. I don't have a lot of photographs, but this is what I could piece together. So Lily's parents are on top, Nellie and Eliezer Meyer, and the 6 children, 4 of the 6 children where I had photographs. Now, from the left to the right was Joseph. He was the oldest brother, very serious and quiet and studious. Then Sarah was the oldest sister, and she was in many ways the star of the family. She was beautiful and very intelligent. She did well in school and had strong beliefs. She believed in repairing the world, so much so that she protested against the fascist party and landed in jail. And luckily, her dad had the means to bail her out. The next sibling is Bill. So handsome, so fun-loving, closest to Lily in age and in temperament. They were both not great students, and they preferred to spend their time with friends and family pets rather than doing their homework. They also loved a good practical joke. My Aunt Terry told me 2 stories about Bill's sense of humor. Every Friday night he had to go to synagogue with his father, but he could never quite sit still. Because the town was very rural and the roads weren't paved, they were muddy, so the men would take off their muddy boots and put on special slippers to enter the sanctuary. So what did Bill do? While the men were praying, he hid their boots, and then they couldn't find them when they wanted to leave. So that was one of his synagogue pranks. And the other one was when the men were praying, and during Friday night services, you sit and you stand during part of the prayer. So the men would wear these prayer shawls with fringes on the bottom, and the tallis is called. And so Bill snuck behind the men, and he tied the fringes one to another, so that when the men got up during the part of the service that they had to rise, they were kind of all bound together. Now, Bill never really got in trouble for these things because his father, Eliezer Meyer, was a sweet and gentle soul, and thought it was kind of amusing, so he was able to get away with it. So Lily's pranks took place on home turf. She had cousins from the big city of Sighet that would come out to the farm for visits. Her cousin, also named Lilly, was visiting once, and she didn't know much about farm life and animals. So my mother, as a joke, told her that the family cow was a horse and said, "Go ahead, ride her." And of course, she couldn't quite get on the cow. Luckily, the cow started kicking, but thank God no one was hurt. That could have been really ended badly. Another story that my mother told me was how she made sure she got new clothes made just for her. Now, my mother wore Sarah's hand-me-down clothes, which were perfectly serviceable, but my mother was a fashion plate, and she resented having to wear hand-me-downs, and she was always a little bit jealous of Sarah, because Sarah was always held up to be the model daughter, and she was always told, "Why can't you be more like Sarah? Why can't you be studious and well-behaved, blah, blah, blah." So she was a little bit jealous. And, she had big shoes to fill with Sarah as the role model. Anyway, her mother, Nellie, was a very charitable woman, and a lot of the Jewish population of the town of Borșa were poor. So she would send Lily out to the neighbors with a big basket of food. And Lily took an opportunity one day and put her hand-me-down clothes into the basket on the bottom and went to the neighbors and gave them the food and her hand-me-down clothes. And then she told her mother, "Mom, I have nothing to wear." And she said, "Well, why? Where are your clothes?" She said, "I gave them to the neighbors. I thought, you would want me to. That was being charitable, right?" So her mother was pretty annoyed, but Lily did get her way. She had clothes made just for her. And when my mother would tell me these stories, like decades later, she would still get a laugh out of it. So next on this family tree are the younger siblings, Yehuda and Blima. Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of them, and I don't know too much about them, and you'll find out why a little later in the presentation. So life went on as normal for Lily and her family and the Jews of Borșa until 1940, August of 1940, when everything changed. Lily was only 13 years old, and at that time, Northern Transylvania in Romania was taken over by Hungary, who was allied with the Nazis, and the Nazis organized this land grab. So this green area here, light green area here, is Northern Transylvania, and my mother lived right up here along the border towards the border of the dark green and the light green. So the history of Northern Transylvania is that it had been part of Hungary, part of the Kingdom of Hungary, but Hungary lost World War I, so they had to give the land to Romania, and a lot of other land as well they lost after World War I. And now they wanted they wanted their land back. So they had this alliance with the Nazis, and, Nazis were winning the war in 1940, and they got to reclaim all this land. I don't know if you can, oops, sorry. You think they could see the bottom of the slide? Oh, I'm hoping, oops, sorry. I'm not very good with this. Anyway, oops. Oh, help. Sorry, guys. Okay.
That's all you can see.
That's all we can see. Okay. Anyway, that's what I wanted to show you on the map. So at first, the Jews of Northern Transylvania weren't alarmed to be rejoining Hungary after 20 years of being part of Romania, because after all, they had experienced anti-Semitism under Romanian rule. And a lot of the Jews from Transylvania and Hungary fought in World War I to defend Hungary, and they had some remaining loyalty. However, they were very quickly disillusioned when the Hungarians immediately passed severe anti-Jewish laws. So these new laws banned Jews from working in many of their professions and businesses, and many now no longer had a way to earn a living. Jewish children were banned from attending secular school, so Lilly and her siblings could only now attend Yiddish or Hebrew school. Additionally, Jewish businesses that were still allowed to operate were now forced to stay open on the Sabbath, which is a day when religious Jews should absolutely conduct no commerce. So grandfather refused to comply, and his general store was shut down. Racial laws were passed in Hungary, similar to those passed earlier in Germany as to who is a Jew. Marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew was banned, and even dating a Jew could land you in jail, because the Jews were seen as a lesser race, and to mingle would be to pollute the dominant Hungarian population. To make matters worse, because Lilly's house was one of the largest in town, one day a group of Hungarian soldiers knocked on the door and demanded that the family lodge them because they had so much space. So they were forced to do so. And imagine that, living with the enemy. So Lilly's home, which before had been so warm and joyful, was made into a kind of prison once the troops moved in there. And the family were made to feel like unwelcome guests in their own home. Now, Hungary had established a Hungarian labor service system. This was very particular to Hungary. This was for so-called unreliable and undesirable men to participate in the military, and these undesirables were mainly Jewish men. So they would be drafted into this labor service system. They weren't given any uniforms or any weapons, and they had to do the most dangerous and back-breaking work, like digging trenches, repairing rail tracks, roads, and clearing minefields. And many young Hungarian Jewish men would die of disease, starvation, and physical abuse in forced labor. Brother Joseph, the oldest brother, around this time had to leave home because he was called up into this forced labor service. With things getting worse and worse for the Jews, the Romanian housemaids who worked for Lilly's mother offered to hide the children up in the mountains to keep them safe. Lilly's parents and grandfather did not know what to do. It was a tough decision, but in the end, they thought that the family would be better off staying together, and they still thought they could protect their kids, so they didn't hide the children. So Lilly's family would really come to deeply, deeply regret that decision, because in early 1944, Hungary saw the direction the war was going in, and that the Axis powers were losing. And they secretly tried to get out of a pact that they had with Germany, but the Germans got wind of this, and in March of 1944, they occupied Hungary. Now, Hitler's hatred of the Jews was such that even though Germany was losing the war, it was more important for him to spend his dwindling resources on mobilizing to murder every last Jew in Europe. He may not have been able to win the war against the Russians and the Allied powers, but he felt he could still win the war against the Jews. The Hungarian Jews would be the last population of European Jews to be selected for mass extermination. Working together with the Hungarian police, military, and other officials, they forced the Jewish population from their homes and concentrated them into ghettos. In April 1944, shortly after Lilly's 17th birthday, her family and all the Jews in town evacuated Borșa and went to a neighboring town of Vishu de Sus, where the nearest Jewish ghetto was established. Her brother Joseph didn't go to the ghetto because he was already in forced labor. Lilly's grandmother had passed away around this time of liver cancer, so she didn't go. But her grandfather, her mother and father, Sarah, Bill, Lilly, Yehuda, and Blima all left for Vishu, and they were able to find shelter in the town with some cousins who happened to live within the ghetto walls, and that's where they stayed. Now, conditions in the ghetto were pretty grim. Food and medicine were scarce. The Hungarian authorities had stripped the Jews of any valuables when they were forced out of their homes. And they were even beaten in the ghetto if they suspected they were still hiding some valuables. So they had very little to barter with or pay for food with. Keeping clean was a luxury. They were so cramped at night, they barely had room to stretch out and sleep. They would stay in the ghetto for only 1 month. The Russian army was advancing, and the Germans had no time to waste. So they sped up the process of deportation of the Jews to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a notorious extermination camp, which also had a forced labor camp within it. In May of 1944, transports from the ghetto in Borșa and other parts of Hungary began. A few months later, the area would be liberated by the Russians, but unfortunately was a few months too late for Lilly and her family. 8 of my family members, my great-grandfather, my grandmother and grandfather, my mother, Lilly, her siblings, Sarah, Bill, Yehuda, and Blima, were forced onto freight trains, standing shoulder to shoulder as the doors slammed shut. For 2 brutal days, they traveled like that with little food or water and no privacy. When the train finally stopped at Auschwitz, they were ordered to get out fast. The Nazi guards shined flashlights in their eyes, and German shepherds were straining at their leashes, barking at them ready to pounce. The men were immediately separated from the women and children. The women were further ordered to line up and were sent either to the left or to the right. My mother, Lilly, and her older sister, Sarah, who were 17 and 21 years old at the time, were ordered to the right, along with their mother, Nellie. But Yehuda and Blima, who were only 15 and 13 at the time, were ordered to go left. Now, Nellie, as a mother, couldn't bear to leave her 2 youngest children alone to their fate. I don't know if she realized what their fate was at that time, but she crossed over to the left line so that they wouldn't be alone to be with them. And my mother, Lilly, she tried to do the same thing. She wanted to be with her mother too, but Sarah pulled her back to the right. And that was the first, but not the last time that Sarah would save my mother's life during the war. It was May 24th, 1944, the same day they arrived at Auschwitz, that Lily's grandfather, Moshe, her mother, Nellie, and her younger brother and sister, Yehuda and Blima, were put to death in the gas chambers. Of the 1.1 million Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz, the Jews of Hungary made up the largest percentage by country, 430,000 of them. Of that population, unbelievably, 80% were murdered upon arrival. So this is, I'm trying, I don't know how well you can see these next few slides or get the impact of it, but we went to visit Auschwitz after we went to Romania in May of 2019. And there was a room with massive binders with names of all the victims, I don't know, 4 feet tall, 5 feet, hard for me to know. Written on both sides, names of victims. Oops. Here's another shot of it. And I tried to look for my mother's family. I tried to look for Nellie, Blima, and Yehuda, but and Moshe Chaim, the grandfather, but I couldn't find them. There were so many pages and pages and pages of Davidowitz, Davidovich, spelled all kinds of different ways. I couldn't find it, but I did find my father's family's page, and here it is. And it has the name in alphabetical order, and then it's, murdered in Auschwitz. Really, really hard to comprehend. So after the initial selection process, Lilly and Sarah, along with the other female prisoners, were stripped of their clothing and given striped, raggedy uniforms and wooden clogs for shoes. They were forced to line up at attention each morning and evening for appel. Appel was the roll call that the prisoners had to endure by the guards. They had to stand perfectly still in silence, sometimes for hours while they were examined and counted. And if one of them looked sickly, they were pulled off and never seen again. If one of them was coughing or speaking when they should have remained silent, they were also never seen again. My mother told me that Sarah would pinch her cheeks to make sure that she had color in her face so that she looked healthy. And they both stood perfectly still and silent twice a day like that for hours. And they breathed a small sigh of relief each time roll call was over. Now, these photos I have are not, post-war and, not, obviously not the way they would have looked while they were in the camps, but I just wanted to show you the two of them together because they would remain together throughout the war. So after a month at Auschwitz, Lilly and Sarah were again forced onto a freight train bound for northern Poland. This concentration camp was called Stutthof, near Gdansk, Poland, and near the Lithuanian border. My mother was put to work in a grenade factory, as many of the prisoners at labor camp were forced to support the German war effort. Her job was to fill the grenades with explosive chemicals. The chemicals burned her throat and turned her skin a sickly shade of blue. Sarah, meanwhile, figured out that she could get them a little extra food if she were to volunteer at the camp's hospital. So she was always using her head, and a great person to be with if you wanted to survive. So that's what she did. And every night they would meet after work. They'd meet in the barracks, and Sarah would give her that extra little crumb of bread, whatever she could get to keep my mother going. And really that extra crumb, they were fed a starvation diet, so that extra crumb really could mean the difference between life and death, because they were living on watery coffee, watery soup, and a thin slice of bread to do horrible long hours of work every day. So the days stretched into weeks and then into months with the same routine. Hard work, exhaustion, fear, and hunger were their daily lives. Still, Lilly had Sarah's support, and Sarah had a mission to keep Lilly alive. So they leaned on each other and they tried their best to get through each day without giving in to despair. Lilly and Sarah were interned at Stutthof for 5 months, from August 1944 until January 1945, when the Germans evacuated the camp to flee the advancing Russian army. Her entire unit of female prisoners was forced to march into brutally frigid conditions in threadbare uniforms and inadequate shoes, sometimes even shoeless. Those who were too weak or too slow to go on were shot and left to die in the snow. Some froze to death. So they marched like that for 2 long days. By the second night, Sarah noticed lights from a distant farmhouse, and she knew that if they continued marching in those conditions, they had little chance to survive. So Sarah, Lilly, and 3 women that were with them from their hometown broke off the line and made a run for it. The farmhouse had a large barn. They hid in the hayloft and spent the night there. In the morning, the lady of the house entered the barn to feed the animals. Sarah presented herself. She persuaded the woman that she should help them and give them food and lodging because the Russians were coming and that she would be rewarded for helping them. The lady agreed that if Sarah helped with the housework, she could stay. There was one small problem, though. The house was filled with wounded German soldiers that the woman was forced to tend to. But the woman gave Sarah a headscarf and some clothes, and Sarah spoke fluent German, and she was able to work in the house and not be disturbed by the German soldiers. Now, a few days later, there was a commotion and shooting. A troop of Russian soldiers had arrived. Seeing the Germans, they started shooting indiscriminately, and they almost shot at Lilly and Sarah and their friends. So Lilly and Sarah yelled out, "Ivray, Ivray," we are Jews in Russian, but they seemed not to understand. Luckily, the captain was Jewish, and he saw what was happening, and he ordered the men to stop before any of the women was hurt. So this Russian captain was kind to Lilly, Sarah, and their friends, and he knew he had to get them out of harm's way because the Russian soldiers that were advancing, could not really be trusted to look after their best interests and make a distinction between them and the Poles and, the enemy, whoever. So he saved their lives, may have saved their lives, probably did. He took them away to a hospital in Bromberg, Poland, and they stayed there and they regained their strength. Now, to show you kind of the journey that Lilly and Sarah made, they went from Borșa, which has the red circle on it, to Vyšew, which was where the ghetto was, to Stutthof. You see the Polish name. Oops, sorry. I'm trying to point at it. What? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, my daughter's correcting me. So, sorry. They went from Borșa to Vyšew to the ghetto. Here is Auschwitz. From there, the second concentration camp was Stutthof. Now these names are in Polish, so they're hard to see, but this is Stutthof. And then after Stutthof, Bromberg, and then eventually back home again. So it was April of 45. The war was practically over. Hitler would commit suicide, a few days later. Conditions were stabilizing. They were strong enough, and they left the hospital, and they made their way back, all the way back home to Borșa, which was a very long journey back. Trains had no particular schedules, and there were long delays and frequent stoppages. Oops. Sorry. I got to get better at this, guys. Maybe the next presentation, I'll have it down pat. Okay. So Lilly and Sarah were the first of their family to return to their home. And the home was occupied by other Jewish survivors from the town of Borșa. So they had a nice reunion. Now, they didn't know at this point who had survived, if anybody had survived. So miraculously, really miraculously, their father returned home next. He had survived at least 3 concentration camps that I know of, maybe even more. But he came back home. And then Joseph came back home from forced labor. Brother Bill, who was in several camps like their father, Eliezer Meyer, he was in several camps during the war. He had succumbed to typhus, and he was recuperating in a hospital. So he was the last to return home. So incredibly, Lily's father and 3 of her siblings have survived against all odds. And they had a wonderful reunion, but sadly, their grandfather, mother, and 2 younger siblings could not be part of the joyful reunion. Now, my mother I don't know anything sad, very, very sadly about Yehuda and Blima, because it was just too terribly painful for my mother to talk about them, but I honor their memory. I honor their memory always. So after the war, the family wanted to get on with their lives. And they did. My grandfather remarried a lovely woman named Rivka from the town. And my Aunt Sarah and Uncle Joseph met their spouses, and they all went to Israel. But my mother, how did she? So my mother met my father. Her father reopened their general store after the war. And my father and his partner, Eli, who was married to my mother's cousin, had a leather store in the bigger town of Sighet. So my mother would go to the town of Sighet and buy leather goods for their general store back in Borșa. Now, the first couple times my mother went, my father wasn't there. He was on a business trip, sourcing goods. So Eli was there, and my mother would buy on credit. And at that time, the inflation rate was very, very high. And, money became worthless day after day as the inflation rate went up. So one day my father was looking at the books and he said, "Who is this Leah Davidovich that's running up these big bills?" And Leah Davidovich was my mother's name before she became Lilly Gutman. And Eli looked at my father and he said, "Wait till you see Leah. You're going to forget all about those debts." And sure enough, finally, my mother and father met. My mother came to the store. My father took one look at her and all was forgiven. And they had a 3-month courtship, and they were married in September 17th, 1946 in Borșa, in their hometown. So at this point, half the family had gone to live in Israel. Brother Bill was living in US-occupied Munich, Germany. He was making a good living dealing in black market goods. My parents decided to join him there, but they're really what they wanted to do was eventually get to the US. Now, when my parents got to Germany, this was US-occupied Munich, right? There was very little lodging to be had. There was a lot of destruction, and there was little lodging. And the Americans insisted that if the citizens had extra room, they would be compelled to house the Jewish refugees. So my parents went to this professor's home and his wife and asked for lodging. And at first they really tried to discourage them. Of course, they didn't want to share their home with these Jewish strangers. But, my parents insisted on moving in. They had no place else to go, and they had to accommodate them. So they moved in. But God bless my mother. She was able to charm them, and they were able to get along amicably. And when my parents finally got papers to immigrate to New York, they were actually sad to see them go. And, here's a picture of the three of them together. My mother, of course, the one on the left. And my mother actually, forgave them and felt sorry for them because they had lost sons during the war. And my mother would say in her Showa tape, after all, the Germans are people too. People are people. My mother had such a big heart. What can I tell you? Amazing woman. Well, after my parents passed away, looking through their papers, I found this passport that my mother used when her and my dad were living in Germany. And they traveled to Israel. They wanted to see the rest of the family. They were always close with the family. And they, throughout the years, they would make sure every few years or whenever they could afford to go, they would try to visit the family in Israel. So they used this displaced person's passport, and it says Leah Gutman on it. She wasn't yet Lilly, she was a stateless person. My dad too. They were refugees. They had no home. So my parents finally landed in New York in May of 1951. My father had an Uncle Joe that came from Hungary in the 1920s to avoid military service, so he sponsored them, although it took many years even so. So they landed in the Bronx, my parents, and Bill was soon to follow. And Bill married my Aunt Terry and had 3 children, and we were all very close. And here's a picture of me at 3 years old. It took my parents 10 years to have me. I'm an only child, and this is actually a picture that was taken when we went to visit Israel. So we lived in the Bronx together with Terry, Bill, Neil, Mark, and Karen. And when the Bronx became unlivable, we moved to Paramus, New Jersey. So we had a visit in 1960-something from Sarah. And here's a picture of the bungalow colony where they spent the summers in Monticello. And Sarah's on the left, and Bill is in the middle, and Lilly is on the right. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful reunion. I remember Sarah was just so sweet and lovely and warm. And, you know, many years passed by, everybody living together in Paramus with my cousins. Life was good until I was 16 years old. My mother got a letter from Israel with some horrible news. Her sister Sarah was very sick. She had cancer. Now, my mother broke down like I've never seen anybody break down when she heard that news. I'd never seen her cry before that I could remember, but she was just inconsolable. And my father and I, we were so helpless. We didn't know how to comfort her, and she was just fell to pieces because she had adored Sarah, and just Sarah saved her life. So my mother decided to do something, you know, kind of, you know, I don't know to call it rash, but it was what she felt she had to do. She decided we had to move to Israel to take care of Sarah. And we left everything. We left our home, my school, friends, and family for a new life in a new country. And I was quite anxious about it. I didn't speak any Hebrew, had no idea what to expect, but you know what? I never complained. I never said a word. I never expressed any anxiety to my mother or father because I knew my mother was so upset. And so we moved. And very, very sadly, Sarah was very, very sick by the time we got there. And she was going to pass away after a few months of our arrival. And a year after that, my grandfather, Eliezer Meyer, passed away. So I graduated high school. We had spent 2 years in Israel, and my parents told me we were going to take a summer vacation back to New Jersey to visit Aunt Terry, Uncle Bill, the cousins, Neil, Mark, and Karen, the rest of the family. And I was very happy to go because I missed them. And I, you know, missed the States. But I was only told after we got there, oh, by the way, we're not moving back. We're staying here. And I hadn't even said a proper goodbye to my friends in Israel. I thought I was going to see them in September. But my parents just found it too difficult to adjust to a new life and culture in Israel. And they found they had less reason to stay once Sarah and my grandfather were gone. So they decided to move back to the US. And again, I was so concerned, you know, to cause them any further suffering. I had gone along with these 2 major upheavals in my life, never voicing a complaint or concern to my parents. Although I didn't connect the dots for many years, all of the suppressing of my feelings and thwarting of my needs during my childhood did take a toll on me. I found it difficult to know what it was that I really wanted in life and what I wished to pursue. And I came to realize that this burden I carried was a legacy of my parents' past trauma that was passed along to me. My parents were brutalized as young people, along with their families, not for any crime they committed, but for the simple reason that they were born Jewish during a time in Europe when to be Jewish was to be considered subhuman and not worthy of life. The terrible hatred that led to the Holocaust not only scarred the survivors, but left wounds on their descendants as well. But I healed myself, and I really appreciate how brave and resilient my mother was. Although she carried deep wounds that never really healed, she and my dad were able to make a good life for themselves after the horrors of the war. They learned to speak English, they found work, they stayed close to family, and formed a tight circle of friends. My mother had the strength and resolve to carry on and build a new life on the ashes of her old one. And here's a picture of my mother at Emily's Bat Mitzvah again. You can just see how joyful she was. So, my mother survived and thrived against all odds, and that fact gives me hope for the future. We can and we must fight against all forms of bigotry, against Jews and other minorities who are marginalized. This summer, we saw worldwide protests from all people of all walks of life and all religions, races, and nationalities unite to protest racial and social injustices in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. I believe that most people have the capacity and inner yearning for fairness and justice. I believe that we can live peacefully among those who are different from us and give each person the respect and dignity that they so deserve. And once this happens, the world will truly heal, and atrocities like the Holocaust will not have to be repeated. So thank you. That ends my presentation, and I thank you so much for your attention and for listening to my story and for honoring my mother's memory in this way.
Okay, we can start to take questions in the Q&A and chat. If anyone has a question that they want to ask by voice, please click the raise hand button or request it in the chat or Q&A. We have a question in the Q&A from IG saying thank you. And we have a question in the chat from Deborah. Has your father also told his family story to the Shoah Project?
Yes, he did. I have a tape of my father. My father had a different experience than my mother. My father had the experience that my mother's brother Joseph had, that is to say that he was in forced labor, and he has quite a remarkable story to tell that I will eventually, I'm hoping to tell his story eventually, and I have to do some additional research about that. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a lot of family members that are alive today, so it's hard for me to get some information, but he did do a Shoah tape, and his cousin Anshi, who was from the same town as my father, who was a bit younger, who happened to go to school with Elie Wiesel, also did a tape. So I just discovered his tape and I started listening to it. Yeah, my father's story it was just too much to tell both at once. And, I thought it would just be more focused to tell the stories individually. So yes, stay tuned. My father's did give testimony, and I will be eventually telling his story as well.
We have a request for voice chat from Anita. I'm going to allow Anita to talk.
Oh, wonderful.
Anita, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do a voice chat, but that's okay. I just wanted to ask if your mom ever had any dealings or groups of other survivors that she met with or spoke with about their shared experience?
It's a great question. All of her friends, not all of them, a lot of her friends were survivors or spouses. One spouse would be American and one spouse would be a survivor. So that was, the community that they had. And, I don't know. I think they felt very comfortable with one another. They had a shared experience. There was never any, support group. And I don't know that I don't recall, them sitting around and talking about it. They really preferred to focus on the positive in life when they got together. I think it's kind of a shame in a way. I think, times were different then. I think they were kind of encouraged not to talk about it in a way. I know that many survivors that wound up in Israel were really discouraged from talking about it because, you had to be a tough sabra and you didn't want to be the victim, be portrayed as the victim. So in any case, I don't, they never really got the psychological help that they needed. And, I think they did take comfort in the fact that their friends were survivors, and that was kind of, their support, even if they, maybe they didn't talk about it very much, or at least not that I know of, not when I was around.
We have a few comments and then another question. Karen says, Shelly, you are amazing. Thank you.
Aw.
Suzanne?
Karen is Bill's daughter, by the way. My first cousin Karen, she's my Uncle Bill's daughter. So I'm so glad you could make it tonight, Karen. Love you.
Suzanne says, beautiful job, Shelly. Your mom would be proud.
Thank you. I am kind of related to Suzanne by marriage. My grandfather, when he remarried after the war, he married Suzanne's great aunt. Yes, I think her great aunt. So Suzanne and I are long-term friends and kind of family as well. So thank you, Suzanne.
Dan says, thank you so much for sharing your mother's story, Shelly.
You're welcome, Dan. Thank you. Dan's dad is doing a lot of research about the Holocaust, so I'm interested to meet with him one day.
Leora says, a great story of my mother, Lily, visiting your mother and the story about the cow. I never heard it.
Yes. Happy to share it. Happy to share it. It was a great story. Great story. I wanted to tell about the happier times of my mother's life too. It wasn't, that she shouldn't only be defined by the Holocaust. She had a beautiful life when she was younger, and beautiful, warm, loving family, and, played pranks, and, was a rascally kid. And, and yes, she still got a kick out of that in her adulthood. So, yeah.
We have a question from Nan in the Q&A. My mother also worked in the munitions factories for the Germans and talked about the Americans bombing the factories and losing dozens of girls in the bombings. Did your mother ever mention this?
No, she never did. She never did. And Nan is a cousin on my mother's side. So, thank you, family, for being here tonight. It means a lot to me, and thank you, friends, and thank you, the community. But no, she never mentioned that. Didn't mention it, so maybe they didn't hit the munitions factory in Stutthof. I don't know, but that's interesting. I'd like to hear more about your mother's experience and what camp that was, where that happened. There's so many Holocaust stories. I mean, each story is unique and, miraculous and really, heartwarming, amazing what human beings can overcome. And by the way, Nan, your mother Zita was the one, I don't know if I mentioned it, she was the one that told me about the fire in Borșa. I don't remember when she told me, but she was surprised that I hadn't heard about it, and she knew about it. So,
We do not have any questions in the Q&A, in the chat. I see a comment from Nan saying, I never heard that story.
Oh, okay. We get bits and pieces, and you know, that, I mean, you know, it's really, you know, it's sad. I mean, I deeply regret that I didn't ask my parents more questions while they were alive, and that I kind of came to this so late in my own life that, you know, that I missed a lot of information. But at the same time, I'm grateful to know what I knew, because I've met other second generation survivors, and they know virtually nothing because their parents were dead silent. And of course, that silence was a heavy silence. And that silence spoke volumes, but they really didn't have any details. And I have these lovely, charming stories, and I have Shabbat stories, you know, thanks to the stories that my mother told, you know, my aunts and my cousins. And yeah, they saved it for me. And I'm very, you know, very, very, very grateful to know what I do know.
We have a
And
couple, oh, sorry.
yeah, no, I'm just very happy to pass along these tidbits to family who did not know these things.
We have a couple more comments in the chat. Tina says, thank you for opening your heart and sharing your mother and loved ones with all of us.
Well, thank you, Tina. Tina's a fellow Irvington mom, and I'm sorry I can't see all your faces. I thought it would, I don't know, we chose this format. It's my first time, and I missed you all. Haven't seen a lot of people because of COVID, but you know, I'm so grateful that you could come tonight, and I hope everyone stays happy and healthy.
We have a comment from Elise. Thank you for sharing your mother's story. Keep sharing and try to reach some of us who are not informed.
Oh,
Some of those who are not informed.
that's beautiful. Thank you, Elise. I appreciate that. I will. I promise. I was so nervous, you know, but each time I think I tell the story, it'll be a little bit easier. I'm not really used to, not much of a public speaker, but I think it's a story that needs to be told.
We have a comment from Maureen. Thank you so much for sharing these important and remarkable stories with us. Incredibly moving.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you. You're so supportive. You're a supportive friend. Love you.
I guess we're still open for chats and questions. If anyone else has anything to say, Leora says you did amazing.
Thank you.
You've got a wonderful audience here.
They're so supportive. I mean, every audience should be this supportive and wonderful.
Well, Shelly, would you like to allow a couple of minutes just for any other questions or comments to come in, or would you like to start wrapping things up?
I guess we could wrap up if no one has anything else.
Just a couple more comments coming in the chat. Lindsay says, these are indeed important stories. Thank you so much, Shelly. Ronnie Brenner says, thank you. I see someone has raised their hand. I'm going to allow Cindy to talk. Cindy, you'll have to unmute.
Shelly, you did an awesome job.
Thank you, Cindy.
Hi, and it was wonderful.
Great job, Shelly.
Learning so much about your mom and the family. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, and I have to thank you, and I have to thank your daughter Amy for providing me some of the details on this story when my mother sat down to talk to her years ago when Amy was doing a Holocaust project, so thank you. And that's cousin Mark, that's Bill's son, and Cindy, his wife.
Thank you. You
Lovely
did
wife.
great.
Thank you.
We have a question that came in the Q&A from Maureen. Did your parents ever connect again with the German professor and his wife after they came to the US?
Not that I know of, not that I know of. And I was looking around for, you know, I have to organize my papers, but I think I have his name somewhere, and on some document I have an address, but I don't believe they ever did, or if they did, I don't know about it, you know. I don't believe they ever went back to Germany after they came to the U.S. They went back to Romania for a visit, but I don't think they ever went back to Germany. So I don't think they were in touch with that couple. Maybe they passed some letters, but I don't know. Gee, all the things you wish you knew and you wish you had, but yeah, I don't really know.
We have a comment in the chat from Shari. Thanks, Shelly. Love you.
Love you too, Sherry.
Okay. And it is 8:40 p.m. So unless there are any other pressing questions, and if anyone thinks of something they want to ask after the fact, after this call is ended, they can email the library at irvref, that's irvref, at wlsmail.org, or email me directly at kroman, R-O-M-A-N, at wlsmail.org. Or, of course, those of you who are friends and family of Shelley can ask her directly, I suppose.
Yes, please do. Don't hesitate.
That's not usually an option we have with presenters.
I packed the cords. What can I say?
So, okay, so it doesn't look like there's any other questions or comments coming in at the moment. Shelley, do you have any closing thoughts, anything you want to say before I wrap things up here?
No, just thank you everybody for listening. Let's keep the faith. Let's be optimistic. I feel better, today than I did last week at this time. So, let's hope for a brighter future and a more unified country, and an end to all this crazy hatred and disagreement. And yeah, let's hope for more love, less hate, more understanding.